North Deal in the 1950s, when I was a youngster, was a far different place to how it is now. The old part of the seafront had character, and one could imagine the activity that was happening there many years before, with its boats and large capstans, a highlight on the scenery. All this is now gone, and walking from Central Parade north to Sandown Castle, there is nothing except a sea wall and promenade. In this film, I'll walk south from Sandown Castle and describe in part what it was like in the 1950s. Starting at the air raid shelter by Sandown Castle and walking to just past the Coast Guard station, there was a small sea wall with occasional wooden groins. These were replaced in the 1950s with the now metal groins with green heart wood, and a new sea wall was built. Leaving the Coast Guard station and moving southwards to Exchange Street, the beach used to come almost right up to the houses and as far along to the sea girt, which was pulled down during this period. South of the Coast Guard stood the Rowing Club, the Foresters Pub and the North Star Pub, and the Angling Club, which was in the old North Deal Lifeboat House. The Royal Navy Association held meetings in here in the 1980s. Mick Walls had a small amusement park and skating ring just to the north of the sea girt. There were public toilets there as well. This has now all been built on. At the top of Exchange Street, opposite the Mission to Seaman's House, were where Claire Hickman's boats, the If Not and Why Not, were stationed, and Elf Sunny Bet's boat, the Rose and Mary. Also the Skylark was berthed here. The Royal Exchange Hotel and Pub was located here, and just to the south the Mary Hopham's almshouses, which were for the allocation of fishermen only. The sewer pipe was also in location on the beach opposite Golden Street. The sea girt, which was still standing during the 1950s, had a Lewis gun on its parapet, which was used during the Second World War. This area of North Deal was, in the old days, graced with large capstans and many boats of all sizes. A few boats were still in location in the 1950s. Moving south past the almshouses, we passed several pubs, including the Albion, the Pelican and the Three Compasses further down. But almost opposite the covering seats at the top of Farrier Street lies McDonald's Paper Shop. Turning right by the covering seat at the top of Farrier Street, we proceed down towards Middle Street, and on the left is the Dill Lugger off licence and shop, with Harry Upton's house on the right. Turn left into Middle Street, and on the left is Old Mother Crew's shop. You could buy almost anything in there. Moving south we come to the Fat Lady's junk store, and a bit further along on the right is Barlow's shop. Then Bob Abel's Dill Marine Craft boat building store. I served my apprenticeship here in the 1960s. On the opposite side of the road is Terry Frank's gun and tackle shop. Walking up Coppin Street, halfway up on the left were the Harris family and the Budds. Then next to the Three Compasses was Tommy Upton's house. On the right halfway up was Johnny Budd's house, and behind this was formed the first Salvation Army Hall, which backed onto our house at 6 Brewer Street. At the top of Coppin Street, on Beach Street, we see Togo Harris's boat, the Kirby. Then moving south we come to Jim Skardon's boat, the Mary Ann, and then Tommy Upton's boats. In the mid-1950s, the Golden Harvester and Skylark were here as well. The Golden Harvester was skippered by Johnny Revel. It was impounded one day for smuggling and laid on the seafront for many weeks. Johnny was eventually fined and the boat released. Bob Abel took over Tommy Upton's plots and built up his fleet of Blue Line boats. I used to skipper the Heidi in the early 1960s. Tommy Upton had a large hut on the beach opposite Brewer Street, in which his parrot resided. Walking south from here, we come to the motorboat Fascinator, owned by Bert Tookie. He lived a couple of doors away from the cruise shop in Middle Street. We then approach Togo Harris's boats, then Bill Bailey's boats. This takes us up to the garden, just before the Royal Hotel. On the opposite side of the road, at the top of Brewer Street, we have Adelaide House. Going down Brewer Street was my family's home at number 6. This is where my father's fish business and large smokery was. Father used to buy thousands of herrings for smoking in the winter, and trade was always good. Horses were kept here, and later the stables were turned into a cold store and a shop. Next door at number 5 was Bill Bailey and his wife, and at number 4 was Mrs. Upton. Number 3 was where the Willis brothers, who were bait diggers, lived. This is where they sold their bait. Moving on, at number 2 is where the Moore sisters lived, and next to them was the Dola Dairies, which went right down to the bottom of Brewer Street. On the opposite side of the road, at the top of Brewer Street, lived Mr. Winstanley, and in the cottage further down were 2 old ladies. I can't remember their name at present. Then there was the woodyard, which went straight through to Oak Street, and the little house called the Nook, which was next to the Sunday school known as Feed My Lambs. This was once a soup kitchen. In the later days, Stewart and Duns used it for photography development. It then became a doctor's. At the bottom of Brewer Street, in Middle Street, was Johnny Rogers, a bait digger. Turning left, you come across Skardon's fish and chip shop, and next door to this was a small junk shop. Opposite this is what we called the Old Mansion. It is now a car park. The first nuclear shelter was situated here. Now we turn left and go up Oak Street. On the right stood Victor Edgerton's building stores, and on the left on the corner was a derelict bomb site where once a house stood. Next to this lived Robert Skardon, owner of the Skardon's fish and chip shop, and next to him lived George Skardon. Then further up the road was Cavill's office, and opposite was their storage yard. We crossed the alley and come to the Star and Garter pub, which was situated on the corner of Beach Street and Oak Street. Turning right into Beach Street, we find Mr. Ling's Cafe on the right, and a bit further along is DeVito's ice cream parlour with the Royal Hotel on the seaward side. Going back to the top of Brewer Street, the skipjack lies to the south of Tommy Upton's hut, from which trips were offered during the summer. Before the war, scaffold poles and wire were placed along the low water mark and stretched the length of the foreshore to evade an invasion, with a couple of breaks in it to allow boats to be launched, so boatmen could continue with their occupation. One of Tommy Upton's boats, the Minnie Ha-Ha, was bought by my father James Skardon in the late 1950's. It was taken down to Courtmarsh Farm, which my dad owned at the time, and she was completely rebuilt. She was then named the Fair Chance and stationed at the top of King Street with the Mary Ann and his other boat, the Fairway, which was once owned by Harry Meekins and called the Lady Beatty. Tommy Upton's boats were also the Paddle Punt's Golden Warbler, the Tom, Kittiwake, Isabel, and the Foresail Mizzen Punt's Fascinator, later owned by Bert Tookie, and the Kingfisher, along with the galleys Seaman's Hope and the Bluebell. Harry Upton had the punt Ethel and the cod punt Little Dick. Bill Bailey was situated a bit further south, opposite the Star and Garter pub. He lived in 5 Brewer Street. He had the motorboat Irene, which was skippered by Frank Preston, also the 2 paddle punts. One was the Jessie. In the late 1950's, Bob Abel's boats graced the stage at the top of Brewer Street, with Johnny Revel, known as Nutty, Joey Smith and Ernie Slack as skippers, and myself, David Skardon, as beach help, and not forgetting old George Foy, known as Bubbles, who was the mechanic and winchman. These boats were used mainly for angling parties, although in the winter the Bridget was used to net for sprats and herring. I went afloat with Nutty Revel on numerous occasions herring fishing as a youngster, and I also used to travel for Huss during the spring and summer in my dad's punt, the Mary Ann. The old times have now faded away into the past, with the beach and seafront deserted and bare. Deal was a hive of activity in the old days, with its boatmen and boats, and a mecca for the visitor, but now it's desolate and bare. Only memories can keep the past alive. Thank you for watching.